Hi, everybody, and welcome to this art and activity themed Art Hangs with MoMA Learning event. It's July 24th, 2014, and we are broadcasting live from the Department of Education at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. My name is Stephanie Pau, and I am one of the 3 co-instructors for the museum's MOOC, Art and Activity, Interactive Strategies for Engaging with Art, which is currently in its 3rd week of a 4-week session. I'm very happy to introduce my colleagues, Jessica Baldenhofer, the lead instructor for this course, and my fellow co-instructor, Lisa Mazzola, who you may know from the Art and Inquiry MOOC. And we're also extremely excited to welcome our very special guest, Lisa Libicki, who is an educator who has years of experience teaching in the MoMA galleries. We've conceived of this hangout as a virtual open house event and encourage you to participate by using the Q&A feature on the right-hand side of this viewing window. You can submit your questions or vote on questions submitted by others, and the most upvoted questions rise to the top and have a better chance of being answered during today's 1-hour event. If you happen to be watching from YouTube, you unfortunately will not be able to submit or read the questions, but we'll do our best to recite the questions out loud before we answer them. So without further delay, I'm going to turn it over to Jessica. And in the meantime, please feel free to start submitting your questions and voting on your favorites. Jessica?
Thanks, Stephanie. So welcome everyone to the Art and Activity Q&A Hangout. It's wonderful that we have this opportunity to have a live conversation with our students. We've all really enjoyed following and being a part of the discussion forum, and I'm in awe of the amount of sharing and exchange that has taken place so far. This time around, it's been amazing to see all the openness in sharing your own artwork, especially from the Take Action videos. That's been really cool for us. And it's wonderful to see all the creativity that you all have in adjusting and reinventing activities for your different students and different audiences, and sometimes for your families, which is really cool. As Stephanie mentioned, we're joined by my colleagues Lisa Mazzola and Stephanie and Lisa Libicki. And I just wanted to give you a little background on Lisa Libicki because the 3 of us are pretty familiar faces for you. So Lisa Libicki's presence on this art hang is really intended to lend a new voice and new perspective to the conversation. Lisa is one of our amazing MoMA educators, and she has years and years of experience as a seasoned museum educator. And she is in the galleries and school classrooms pretty much almost daily, working with students grades K through 12 and working with classroom teachers to develop lessons. So we can all take advantage of having her expertise with us. She is like front line on the front line every day with the kids. So now I'll stop talking, and we really want to open it up to you guys. We want this to be an open conversation. So ask away in the Q&A app, and just to get your minds bubbling, if you have any questions around just teaching with activities in general, or some of the challenges that you've had in creating activities for your students, or even if you have questions for me, Lisa, and Stephanie about developing this course with Coursera, we can answer any and all questions, and we're here for you. So in the meantime, while we're waiting for you guys to think of your questions and ask away, I thought maybe we'd start by asking Lisa Libicki a couple questions. And one of the things I thought might be interesting for you to talk about, Lisa, is sort of how you feel adding activities to your in-gallery lessons, sort of what that adds to the students' learning.
Sure. I think it's really wonderful to be able to give students sort of multiple avenues into working with artworks, and I think discussions can be so enriching for a lot of students, but it's not the way that all students learn. It's not the way that all students feel most comfortable participating actively. So I think by incorporating activities, whether they be art making or writing or movement-based, sound-based, any variety of activities gives sort of this multimodal approach so that different students have different points of entry into thinking about, considering, looking more closely at a work of art. And I think even beyond that, I think just variety in learning is important, so that if you have like an hour-long tour, or if you're taking these ideas and using them in your classroom, if everything is discussion-based, there's no change in the cadence, there's sort of as engaging as a conversation can be, I think it's really valuable to shake things up and put a different spin on thinking and learning and looking. So I feel that's really important to my teaching, and I notice in students that even if a conversation is going great, I have to sometimes like remind myself, wait, this could be a really great opportunity to integrate an activity. Even in as much as this is going really well, there might be new insights provided by, you know, embodying a sculpture or writing a creative response to a painting. So I think those are some of the valuable ways in which an activity can add to a conversation.
Awesome. We actually are starting to get a couple questions trickling in. One of them is, I'm not an art teacher, but I teach science. Do you think I can include the activities we are learning in this course? Good question.
Great. Lisa Mazzola, you wanna answer that one?
Sure, yeah, I think that,
Oh, Lisa, you are muted.
I was trying to be so diligent about following my muting. Yeah, actually, I mean, you know, I think that when you're dealing with science, there's a few kind of, there's a couple of ways you can approach it. I mean, on the one hand, all of the activities that we've introduced in the course, I think really foster, you know, the kind of reasoning and, you know, inquiry that a lot of scientists use and use in approaching the work that they do, sort of the higher order thinking kind of approach. I also think that you can actually apply some of the actual, you know, artworks that we use, or like the ways that we incorporate art also into the science curriculum in terms of not necessarily always the content of the art, and I think that that is something that sometimes does happen, but I think that the way that artists use process, you know, or the artist process, I should say, is another kind of parallel way that you can align with science. So, and I'll let Lisa answer into how she specifically kind of, you know, her experiences with sort of tweaking and tooling around disciplines, around different discipline and content areas. But I think that you can look at both the approach around thinking and inquiry and even non-discursive activities, as well as this idea of process and looking at the artist process and how that kind of aligns with scientific, you know, sort of processes. But Lisa, do you want to add on to that?
Sure. I think what you said in terms of not necessarily always trying to make the content connect, but just like the process of engaging with an art object can be parallel to the process of engaging with either a scientific object or a scientific sort of inquiry is really important. And I feel like I've done activities when I've had science groups and math groups where I've tried to create parallels in art discovery with like parallels in like maybe how you might approach a scientific experiment with like, you know, anything as diverse as like the idea of like hypotheses and testing out your hypothesis. You can do that with, you know, obviously a science experiment, but you can find parallels to that with engaging with a new art object. And so even if the content has no direct correlation with what you're learning about in science, that sort of parallel process can be a really interesting way of taking what you know from your science class, applying to an art object, or vice versa. And then I think like other, you know, I remember once having, I think it was sort of like a logic class, like thinking sort of in a scientific way about necessary and sufficient reasons for something to be assigned to a certain category. So it's sort of like a logic or scientific or mathematic way of thinking, and how can you apply that to looking at an art object. And we did this fun activity with, we turned it into a what makes something art, what's necessary for you to consider this art, what's sufficient, what's both necessary and sufficient. So it was like almost like testing out skills you knew from your science class or math or logic class and applying it to art looking in kind of a quirky but sort of way that students like took knowledge they were familiar with from science and were able to apply it to an art object. as sort of like an extrapolating a skill set they knew.
Yeah, and don't be afraid to tweak and change the things that we presented so that it fits, more closely to your goals too. That's the other thing I would just say is, adaptation of these activities is something that we, knew would happen.
Mm-hmm. So thank you, Marisol, for that question. We have one from Melinda Hollis with 7 votes. Do you have suggestions on teaching multiple grades and ages and learning styles? Most of your activities seemed focused on one grade level at a time. How about smaller schools that have 2 to 3 grades together? Really interesting question.
Yeah, I'm happy to start with that one, and then if you guys have anything to add, I think that's a really great question. Yeah, and I think in a lot of the videos that we developed and activities that we talked about, we thought it would be helpful by kind of guiding them with a certain age or a certain grade level. However, I think there are lots of times when we say, like, this one could work for sort of younger students or older students. So definitely, I would think about a lot of these. If we say 3rd grade, for instance, it usually works really well for like 3rd, 4th, or 5th, So I would think, first of all, to not, stick too much to those kinds of grades that we throw out there. And your students really well. So any ones that we kind of shared with you that you think would be great for your students, even if you tweak them a little bit, you should totally just experiment and try them. And I think just as many of our activities lend to like multiple learning styles for kids, it should apply in the same way to groups that have multiple ages within the group. That if you're offering a lot of options and if the activity is truly open-ended, it can allow for a lot of different sort of cognitive levels. I don't know if Lisa or Lisa have anything to add to that.
Sure. I think, I feel like I've had a lot of experience with mixed age groups, both through, Montessori schools that approach learning that way that have come to MoMA, and also through after-school programs where I've had a lot of mixed ages within one group. And I feel like, just like Jess was saying, if your activity is sort of, you can choose an activity that different students can approach at their developmental level. So I recently had an example where this great Montessori school with K through 3 mixed in the same classrooms came to MoMA, and we had an opportunity to do like a more hands-on drawing activity. We were learning about everyday objects and transforming everyday objects into artworks. And we did like a pretty straightforward activity where I passed out actual everyday objects. They observationally sketched them, and then they had to transform them with like an overlay of vellum or acetate into something else based on various things we had seen in the galleries, sort of as an inspiration. And it worked great because, yes, a kindergartner's sketch from observation is going to look a lot different maybe than a 3rd grader's sketch, and the way they conceptualize transformation is going to be different, but they can each come to that activity at the level that they're at, both sort of drawing skills-wise and creative thinking-wise, and engage with it on their own level.
Jessica, you're able to see the questions, right, Jessica?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Do you have any that you think we should be selecting next?
It looks like this question from Haley Kim looks
okay.
like a good one.
Great. Okay, Haley's question. If I intend to bring a group of students to see a particular exhibition or works of art, what are some effective ways before the actual visit to prepare them without spoiling the experience so that they are ready to engage and dive in during the visit?
Great. Lisa Mazzola, you want to take that one?
Sure. So, I think there's a couple of things. I think that's a great thing to be thinking about. We want to, I think it's great to prepare your students. I think that it's also great to kind of orient them and kind of give them a little sort of teaser about what they're going to experience. And I think that although I totally get this idea of not wanting to spoil the experience in the museum, I think it's good. Also, depending on what your, big idea or theme or topic that you're going to explore is at the museum, I think there's ways that you can use even some of the activities we talked about in the course, discussed in the course, or even just like, throwing works of art, reproductions up, whether you can project them or have actual reproductions for the students to work at, and just engage in a conversation, like start getting that kind of dialogue kind of going around works of art. So I think, again, depending on what it is that you want to do, that you want to explore at the museum, I think, just talking about what museums are, what are, especially depending on, if you're a class that doesn't normally go to museums, kind of having that, like, well, what do museums do, and what are the kinds of museums that you know about, and how would that be similar or different to what you know that they're going to go and experience? I'm not sure if you're talking about I assume, it seems like from the question you're talking about an art museum. So I think it's great to either do something, conversation-based or an actual hands-on based. Maybe, Lisa, you want to chime in about really kind of quick, fun, kind of pre-visit-y type things that you do when you're in the classrooms, which you do, in the classrooms, which you do a lot.
Yeah, I think it's like a fine balance between the spoiler kind of idea and then also really prepping your students in scaffolding and kind of understanding their expectations and helping to prep them for the museum visit. And I feel like when I myself at MoMA, sometimes we educators go into the school and lead the pre-visit ourselves, I feel like I try to definitely not show them examples or reproductions of everything we're going to see, but maybe one of the works I engage the students in a discussion around or an activity around will hopefully be one we'll see at the museum. Or something I like to do is introduce an artwork by an artist that we will see at a museum, but a different artwork by them, so that they have a familiarity with the artist's style, maybe the artist's materials and processes, but they'll get to have a totally new visual experience when they come to the museum, so that they'll be able to maybe do a compare-contrast if there's not too much time separation between the pre-visit and the museum visit, but there'll be a new conversation entirely at the museum, which I think is nice and refreshing. But I think having some understanding of what type of art you're going to see, which artist you're going to be seeing, is nice for students so that they come in kind of excited and engaged already.
Actually, I have a quick follow-up question for you, Lisa. Or actually all of you, all three of you. Do you feel like there's kind of a sweet spot in terms of the timing between a pre-visit and the actual on-site visit? Or maybe it's not hard and fast like that?
Good question. I think personally, I think for younger students, I think it's nice when the pre-visit is not spaced too far in advance of the museum visit, because I think they can make more direct connections between whatever conversation we had, whether it's more logistical, like Lisa Mazzola mentioned, about kind of just making sure they understand what a museum environment will be like, what their experience of looking at art will be like, to like more art-specific connections they can make between the pre-visit and the museum visit. I feel for older students, maybe upper elementary through high school, the gap can be much bigger, and they can like retain and understand those connections over a greater time span. But I do personally, when I have control over it, and I think definitely when I'm talking to the classroom teachers themselves, I think for younger students, I think we've agreed over the years that a kind of a shorter time frame between the visits is better.
Great. Let's see. We have a question from Carolyn Moore Hawthorne. Do you have different activities for students with moderate disabilities, or do you modify activities such as the ones presented in the course? Can you give some examples?
Yeah, so I can start with that one. I think that's a really good question, and I think that that's a topic that we really hope to address more in the course, but it was something that we just, kind of didn't have the time to, and I think it's a really good point. And I guess I'll start, and then I can pass it on to others to chime in too. We did mention maybe once or twice in the course that a lot of these activities can be used for students with, or kids with, different kinds of disabilities. And I think one thing I'll say is that at MoMA, and I think our colleagues in access programs would say this too, is that our approach is really very similar with all kids. And again, sort of as I said before, if the activity is presented in a very open-ended way, and if the instructions are really clear, and if students have choice, and if you allow for, well, you could draw this or you could write this, and you kind of give them different kinds of access points into it, that again not only works for students who have all different learning styles, but also could work with students who might have some kind of disability. And we often have a lot of inclusion classes come to MoMA, so we don't always know, so we don't make any assumptions about where students are, and we create activities that can really be very open-ended and allow for many different kinds of levels to engage in those activities. And I don't know if Lisa or Lisa want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I completely agree with what Jessica was saying, and I think even to just give a concrete example of an activity that I've modified several times in the past, I think a really great conversation for different levels and presented differently can be a question about how artists use different strategies for abstraction, especially thinking about MoMA's collection. And an activity that I've done a lot with that is thinking about someone maybe George O'Keeffe, who is using viewfinders and abstracting by changing a perspective, by changing our point of view, by zooming in, and literally, I mean, you could do it with your hands, but I usually like to present a physical viewfinder to students, and I feel like it's an accessible activity for younger through high school students, and when they like to engage with, you can do it looking at your viewfinder at a painting on view, or you can do it looking at the architecture of your classroom or the museum gallery. But I feel like, for certain students with various disabilities, whether it be sort of motor skills, or whether it be sort of the conceptual idea of how to hold up a viewfinder at a certain distance and maintain that viewpoint rather than holding it up against your eye, that if you modify that activity, instead of holding up a viewfinder at arm's length and closing one eye and looking through the viewfinder, suggests that actually, why don't we physically hand out objects and lay that viewfinder over an object that is larger in scale than the viewfinder itself? It still achieves this idea of looking from a different perspective, looking at a zoomed-in perspective, but motor skills-wise, as well as conceptually, it's a lot more straightforward for students who have a hard time engaging with either physically with the demands of that original activity or conceptually with the demands. And the results, in my experience, have been equally engaging for the students, but have kind of met their needs better by presenting it that other way. So it's just a super concrete example.
That's great. Anyone else have anything else to add to that?
No, I mean, the only thing that I would say is, I think we, before, if any of you were in Art and Inquiry, I think I might have mentioned or put a link in there about Creativity, which is MoMA's is a program that MoMA runs here, and they have a great video on the MoMA website, so it's moma.org, and then you can just search for Creativity, and it's just a great video that talks about that program and how they work with individuals and families. And so that would just be something else that I would throw out there in case anyone was interested in also seeing sort of intergenerational programs being run and that approach. But that was great to hear that actually from you, Lisa, just to hear that modification. That was really, really helpful to hear.
All right, our next question is about readings from Stephen Betteridge. What books would you recommend reading to consolidate and extend the areas covered by your excellent course? Thank you, Stephen. I would say one thing is that we were able to. We didn't want to overwhelm you with. We had many videos, a lot of material, and we really wanted to hone it down to some readings that were, not too long, that were excerpts in many cases, or chapters of longer readings. So one thing that I would say is to continue exploring some of the authors that we did include, you know, such as George Hine, for example, Howard Gardner, because they're very prolific and there's a lot more to their theories and to their experiences than we could possibly cover in this course. So that's one avenue that I would really encourage everyone taking this course to explore. But I want to also open it up to my colleagues to answer.
Yeah, Lisa, do you have any readings that you really love that maybe we don't?
I think in general, I'm having a hard time coming up with titles off the top of my head, and I know Olga Hubbard is on the reading list and was part of the required reading. And I think in addition to her own writings, she does some really amazing sort of lit review type articles where you discover really other wonderful authors through her writing. So she's kind of like my go-to even as an avenue to other writers. But I'm
yeah, and actually, yeah, no, that's a good point, Lisa. And I would also say, you know, what Stephanie said is to look, and actually you can search as she said, the writers that we included. They have much more extensive readings, so we would definitely encourage you to go there. And also, like Olga's articles, her bibliography at the end of her article, and some of those other bibliographies at the end of the articles, you can see some of these other references also, like Lisa's kind of talking about. So I would definitely kind of circle back through those particular authors. And then, you know, the only other thing I would say is we can for sure, you know, I'll give it some thought, and if there's something that, you know, I can review our sort of notes. We had pretty extensive notes about the readings we wanted to include, and, you know, if there was other ones that we didn't include, you know, I can go back and check at our list and maybe post it in the discussion forum of the things that we thought may not necessarily exactly apply, but they were on our sort of, you know, for consideration list. So we can be sure also to like look back at that, and then if we have some follow-up ideas, we can post it for you.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea to start a discussion forum for additional readings.
Yeah.
I would also add, don't forget the blogosphere.
Oh, yeah.
Art museum teaching
Yeah.
which is managed by our colleague Mike Murawski at the Portland Art Museum, is a wonderful resource. And it's also, you know, it's populated by posts by practicing arts educators and museum educators. So I would definitely not forget that, you know, beyond the printed page, there's a lot of resources out there by practitioners in the field. And anything else to add? Jessica, did you have anything to add, or should we move on to the next question?
I think we can move on to the next one.
Okay. All right. Let's see. Nancy Paula Rueda. I'm teaching some students that apparently haven't any interest in learning about art, which is your favorite activity to motivate, which is your favorite activity to motivate and engage them in the art learning?
That is such a good question. You know, we have kids come to MoMA all the time who have never been in a museum, and you know, I don't blame them for sort of walking in with the mentality of like, why should I care, right? Why should I care about this stuff? So I think that's actually a good point, and I think part of that, which I think was addressed a little bit more in art inquiry, is one way we get around that is sort of teaching with universal themes and using these words and themes to really help trigger the kids' ideas about, you know, their own lives and their own personal experience before we kind of introduce them to the art or start looking at the art. So one of the examples I think in the course is that identity icebreaker activity that we use a lot to kind of get kids to think about their own identity and then kind of transfer some of that thinking over to the artwork that they're looking at. So that's like one example, one way. And again, it's so important to find these very valid universal themes that artists are thinking about, that the kids might be thinking about also, that might be really relevant to their lives. And I don't know if Lisa Libicki, you want to pick up on that?
Sure. Yeah, I think the themes and that identity icebreaker activity is a great example of like how a really sort of actively engaged activity-based brainstorm to start the discussion can really be a great point of entry for students who might otherwise not see themselves as people who want to be engaging with art making or art looking. And then I think maybe to be like a little bit more specific in terms of how some activities have helped me with groups that kind of didn't seem on board for an art looking or discussion or making activity. Two of my favorite activities, and I know one was definitely highlighted in this Coursera course, was blind contour drawing. I feel like that's such a great entry point for students for two different reasons. One, everyone's drawing is going to end up looking sort of wacky. So there's not this inhibition about I can't draw, I'm not good at drawing, I have no experience drawing, because the point is not to come up with an amazing drawing in the end. The point is sort of for you to have a closer looking experience, but also sort of this activity-based experience. And I feel especially if you model what a blind contour is for your students and they can laugh at yours with you and the result of it. Although I will say that some of yours that you got, that the students of this Coursera post, of this class posted, are beautiful. Generally, they don't look that beautiful. So I feel like if you show yours and you're willing to be vulnerable in front of your students and kind of model that it's not about this beautiful drawing, it's about, you know, engaging your muscles, engaging your hand, engaging your eye. It's sort of liberating, and even if students, I've noticed, are like, okay, getting into it, I feel like on the flip side, when they're done, when they've looked at their own, when they've looked at their others, and they see the strength of the conversation that comes out of that close looking, you've got them. Like, that seems to be, like, I don't want to call it a trick, but that seems to be like a very successful activity for getting students on board. That's very low stakes, but high rewards. And then similarly, and I can't remember if this has been addressed in the Coursera course, but I really love automatic drawing with students in connection usually with surrealist artists. There's different versions of this, but I like to do maybe like a Juan Miro tied activity where you literally sort of like tell the students to doodle while they're either looking away from their painting, looking away from their paper, or talking to a neighbor so that they're willfully distracted, and just kind of do a doodle and then go back and look at that doodle and embellish it into a drawing of actual objects and forms and figures, which is a nice sort of modeling of a process that surrealists used. But again, it's sort of this like liberating activity. You don't have to have prior drawing classes or skill or engagement with an art object to be able to do that successfully. And I feel like, again, it's one of those things that lets students feel comfortable with both art looking and art making all rolled into one single activity.
I think Lisa and Jess just sort of answered Marzena's question. There was a question that was kind of down on the list there about, you know, what do you do when students kind of can get you know, self-conscious about drawing? So that kind of answers that kind of question too. Yeah, I think that's so true. Like something like that's more sort of playful and kind of low stakes and really isn't about creating something that's perfect and complete, but just really about them kind of engaging with their hand, like you said, in the physical action of drawing. And the only other thing I would add to this question is sometimes, I agree with all of that. Sometimes when I've kind of gotten the impression that, you know, a student is, or a group of students are kind of like, you know, having that feeling of like, well why should I even be looking at this, and what is the connection for me? It's sometimes fun to kind of take them to things that kind of shake up their understanding of what would be in an art museum. You know, it could be something like an installation work or something like, you know, Duchamp's bicycle wheel, and kind of like, you know, sort of the wackier the better, you know, like, well, what's this doing here? And like things that kind of like get them kind of like doing that a little bit, you know, and then all of a sudden you see that little point where they're looking a little, and it's like, okay, well, why do you think that, you know, why do you think this would be here? You know, kind of putting that question out to them and being open about the fact that, you know, sometimes I wonder about things that are in the museum. I think that's really key too, is to like let students know that, like, yeah, I mean, it's people who make choices to put these things here, you know, but so let's just dive into that and you know, wonder about that.
And I have one more note, actually piggybacking on what you just said, Lisa, which is sometimes those conversations with kids about why they don't like a work of art is one of the most interesting conversations that we have. So sometimes, you know, telling kids to like, okay, go off for 10 minutes and find a work of art that you don't like, and then let's come back and talk about it, can sometimes be really, like, it's a way for them to get into it, but it's also some really, you know, it can pull up some really interesting conversations, and also just that they're allowed to say that, you know, because sometimes kids or people in general think that they're supposed to get it, like it, and, you know, the fact that you're kind of allowing them, or making it an allowance that, you know, no, it's totally fine to not like something, and let's just talk about why.
Mm-hmm. I guess just to build off of Marzena's question, though, have you ever encountered a situation where you were doing a drawing activity like blind contour, and someone just flat out refused to participate? And how do you handle that?
Lisa Libicki, you want to take that one?
Sure. Yes, I've definitely over the years encountered that reaction, and definitely depending on, you know, the individual student or the specifics, sometimes it just requires some gentle encouragement or coaxing, and I feel like if a student really seems to chafe at the idea of a certain activity, and it seems like there's like some larger thing that I might not be understanding as this educator who's just visiting them in this classroom for the first time, or just seeing them in the galleries for the first time, and I don't know them, I will try to sometimes offer an alternative. It could be as simple as something Jess mentioned earlier, where if someone really seems to not be willing to do a drawing activity, to give them sort of a parallel writing version of it, if I really feel like I can't get them on board. I am of the mindset that I usually try encouragement before offering alternative ideas, but, you know, I'm happy to do that if that seems to be more appropriate for the students' needs. I almost never just like totally oblige or give in and let them skip the activity. I try to always give them some alternate mode, usually an alternative of my suggested activity, but even if they can't get on board with that, I want them to be engaged with some sort of hands-on experience where their peers are. So I might make it a little more open and offer them maybe a little more freedom in choosing what they're going to do. But it would have to be sort of on a case-by-case basis, I guess, where I would assess what the alternate sort of scenario I would offer would be.
So that actually seems like kind of a good segue to a question where it's the opposite situation, where someone is very dominant in the group. And let's see, this is from Alexandra. What kind of strategies can you use during a museum visit when some people are extremely talkative, making the others feel intimidated and reluctant to express their opinions? How can you practically use their input without letting them shadow the rest? Any strategies around managing overeager participants?
I think, and I'm sure this has come up on some level in this Coursera class as well as Lisa's inquiry Coursera class for those of you who followed it, but I think in general it's great to have a variety of activities, group discussion, partner talks, like small group discussion anyways. So sometimes when I have a student who seems to dominate a conversation or the sharing time or what have you, I'm like, okay, well, this is the perfect opportunity for me to segue into a different type of maybe like small group discussion or partner discussion, so that people have their own chance to share in their own way, in a way that like that person couldn't possibly dominate because they're not involved in that group discussion. And I might just be really careful to pair that one person with a partner or in a small group with other people who I've noticed have been participating a lot, so they're not going to feel overwhelmed in a small group with that more sort of assertive conversationalist. And because I would want to incorporate these various types of partner talk, small talk activities anyways, that might just be like a little bit more encouragement to do it at that moment.
All right. So our next question is from Stephanie Tahiri, and it actually has to do with games. Do you have nice stories or fun examples where the children surprised you and inspired you for new games? And I can chime in on this one. because coincidentally, I am working with some colleagues on actually play testing some new games that we are developing for families. And I have to say, so one of the processes is that's absolutely essential to developing any game is you have to go out and you have to play it, and not just play it with the people who are developing it and are very close to the content, but take it out. And what we do is we either recruit families or, you know, whatever audience we are targeting, or we'll just approach visitors in the galleries and ask them to play a game with us and give us feedback. And every single time we do this, every time we play test something, we're constantly surprised at what works and what doesn't, regardless of audience. But especially with children, and I'm sure this is not something that is unique to games, is I'm always incredibly, I don't know, just pleased, or, you know, not even surprised, because at this point, you know, I've done it so many times, I know the insights that children can bring to bear, and the creativity and the kind of unfiltered creativity that they have with interpreting works of art, or seeing details that you might not notice even after you've, you know, taught with a work of art, you know, a dozen times. So I would say, you know, just through the process of playtesting games, I'm always surprised at how much the game will kind of change over time, and how perceptive children are. Not just children, but also any person that we tend to test the games with. I don't know if anyone else has anything to add.
I can think of like one specific example with I can't remember now what grade they were, but maybe young, maybe like first or second graders, where we were talking a lot about, I can't remember what the overarching theme of the tour was even, but we kept talking about shape and pattern. And this group of students sort of were just like, Lisa, like, we keep talking about shape, like, why don't we, and it almost reminds me of the embodied sculpture activities that Lisa walked you through in this course, but the idea that they were like, okay, we're talking about shape, why don't we try to sit in a shape every time we sit down in front of an artwork with our, like, as a class, like, why don't we make a shape, why don't we sit in a semicircle for this artwork, why don't we sit in a square for this artwork, and it was definitely felt game-like and sort of silly, but also super meaningful, that it like was generated by the kids, it related to what we were focusing on looking at, and we were trying to figure out physically with our bodies how to embody that, and I just thought that was a really nice spirit, that they were taking it out of the paintings and into their own space. Super simple example, but just a nice way that the students were thinking creatively about what they were learning about in the moment.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I can't conjure any specific examples like that off the top of my head right now, but I will say that most of the, you know, as you know from watching video 2.6, any change that you make to any of the elements of a game will modify the game or mod the game. So what I've found is that you know, some of the best mods of the games are really suggested by children who are playtesting the games with us and are approaching it from fresh eyes, and suggest something like, let's do it in, you know, in pairs instead of, or let's try it with a bigger group. And they'll suggest these really simple tweaks that we, you know, we're so close to the game that we can't see it anymore. But once we try it out, you know, we play along with them with this new modification, it totally changes the nature and the spirit of the game. So, yeah. Perhaps we should move on to the next question. Jessica, do you see any that you are particularly interested in addressing at this point? Oh, and you were muted, actually. Sorry.
Okay. I think somebody was asking about historical context for teens for works of art.
Ah, yes. From Chio Flores, how would you incorporate teaching about historical context for teens? Many times it's hard for them to understand that art doesn't happen in a vacuum, and that artists feed on what happens around them?
Yeah, I mean, that's such a good question for so many reasons. I think that it's a question that applies to not just teens, but adult learners, younger children, everyone. And I think it's tricky. I think that there's a sort of balance for how we have to think about as teachers how much they really need to know to be able to get a sense of the work. And I think we, on the one hand, we are big proponents of really looking closely at the work of art and learning as much as possible from that. And it's actually kind of amazing how much kids can get about an artist's work in general just by looking at one object and spending time with that one object, and even about what was happening at the time around art. I think in Lisa's course, Art and Inquiry, she addressed a lot like how much, questions and open-ended conversation can be balanced with giving information, and I think that that's a tough balance also. There's, as educators, we have to think about what tidbits of information, when is it great to bring in the artist's voice to help kind of give context around the work of art. And the last thing I'll say, and I'm sure Lisa and Lisa have some ideas too, is one great just concrete activity for giving historical context is compare and contrast. So if you have two works that are from like a similar time but are addressing either approaching art or approaching a topic in very different ways, that can be a really concrete way to kind of show how they might be reacting off of each other or approaching the same topic in different ways.
Yeah, and I think to piggyback off of what Jessica was just saying, I think, yeah, it's such a fine balance between open inquiry and information, and I feel like, especially when I have older high school groups where I think, the historical context will be really meaningful for them, and they can bring a lot to the table anyways from their studies and kind of expand on what they've already learned through textbooks and films and other artworks and other objects. It's nice, sort of like in a sequence of events, like Jessica said, to compare contrast, but especially like, just to use some examples from MoMA's collection that you could look up online. If you look at, let's say, David Alfaro Siqueiros' Collective Suicide, which was created in the build-up to World War II, and then you look at a Jackson Pollock abstraction that was created in the aftermath of World War II, if you start with students looking at Jackson Pollock and you expect them to have a conversation about the political and historical context, that's pretty overwhelming for not only high school students, but I'd say most adults. And you would have to feed a lot of information, like how is this abstraction possibly connected with the aftermath of war? But if you've already had a conversation with an image that's very concretely dealing with war, even if there's some background explaining that has to be given by the educator, they can get so much on their own. They're already thinking about metaphor and symbolism and historical context, and as Chio said, artists not working in a vacuum, that they're sort of, I would say, primed to look at the Jackson Pollock and be like, okay, how on earth is this not just an abstraction or not just a personal emotive piece? How could this or might this, since the educator is suggesting that it might be, how could this relate to the historical context? How could this mode of mark making be reactionary to World War II? I think they're more set up to understand those connections with less information being fed to them.
Mm-hmm.
Do you guys, do you have any particular question that you think we should be addressing next? I know that there's one from Stephanie again about the final project in Coursera. Do you think we should address that one next?
Sure.
Okay.
Do you want me to?
Sure, go ahead, Lisa.
And so basically Stephanie's question is, can you explain or give examples of the final project for our Coursera course? So let me just, talk a little bit about what we intended, and everyone can chime in, Jess and Stephanie. We don't have examples in the sense that We wouldn't necessarily show you an example, right? Because the idea is that we want you to share with us your ideas. So we don't want to kind of, you know, impose our thoughts on your final project. However, you've actually seen a lot of a sample of the kinds of activities that we use in the museum already in the course. So in terms of examples, you've actually already experienced them in the actual content of the course. And basically what we want is for you guys to have a chance to take what you've learned and really adapt it to something that you're interested in, for the setting that you teach in, that builds off of your sort of teaching interests and creative interests. So it's not any big mystery. There's not one right answer. It's really just an opportunity for you to basically take what you've learned and apply it. And you know, we will keep, you know, following the discussion forums and make sure that there's not other sort of more specific questions about the language that we've used to sort of outline the project, so we can sort of do that in the discussion forum so we don't sort of take time away from this. But really, again, this is really the chance for you to, we hope, create a resource that will be useful for you and hopefully useful for your peers, and for you to get feedback from your peers and really just kind of, you know, give it a chance for you to create your own activities now that you've experienced sort of a range of the things that we've done. Jess, do you want to add on to that?
Yeah, I was just going to say, again, like I think our whole course, all the activities we share are like exactly what Lisa said, like the actual examples for you. But one like sort of tip or note is that, you know, kind of the way we lay out the final project is very sort of linear around like pick an artwork, you know, decide on a theme, and then develop an activity. But we also realize that the way we all plan lessons is more cyclical a lot of times. So you might pick an object and a theme, and then maybe you'll change your theme based on the activity that you start to come up with. And you know, just as you're planning and experimenting and trying the activity out on different people, you'll probably tweak it, which is, you know, all part of the process. So even though we kind of had to write it out in a very linear way, you should really think of it as a more cyclical process of planning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. But I think another thing to add on is, you know, the final project, the way that we structured it is really to kind of give you later on a framework for these are the things to think about, you know, the audience, and you know, who, like, what's the theme that you were building off of. So it's really almost a scaffolding that we hope you'll be able to use on your own after the course.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's a good point. Yeah.
Let's see.
Maybe our last question could be this question about technology.
Okay. Yes. You did the activities that included?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Okay. This is from Raquel. Did you use activities that included tech approaches, like using smartphones, Facebook, the selfie concept, to relate to the work of art and approximate students and their world?
Yeah, this is a really good question, and actually I and the MoMA educators had like some experimenting time with technology this year and thinking about how we could use technology more in the galleries. Not only is it like a big part of the kids' lives, but it's a big part of our lives, and kind of thinking about how we could integrate technology into some of our teaching while also encouraging, you know, kind of being present and looking at the objects in person, because, you know, they're here for just an hour and 15 minutes, which we realized in some of your classrooms you might be using technology in really creative ways to kind of bring art into the classroom, which for us we realize is different in the actual gallery setting. And Lisa Libicki, you should add to this, but we experimented a little bit with using Twitter, and I know some of the educators have even written, like, have these like worksheets of, you know, 40 characters where the kids can kind of react to works of art and kind of write them out on a worksheet, and then we would tweet them later. And we don't necessarily have, you know, I don't think any of us really said, okay, pull out your phones, everybody, we're going to do this. I think that was one thing we kind of thought might be too distracting, but we did kind of want to connect try to connect or experiment with connecting technology to what they're talking about in the classroom. Or what they're talking about in the galleries. And I think one thing that we think about a lot as educators is how to use an iPad as maybe to bring in an artist's voice, to maybe show a video of an artist while they're looking at the work of art, or show another work of art that maybe we don't have in the galleries or even in our collection that might be an interesting compare and contrast. So we do use iPads a lot in that way. And Lisa, I don't know if you have any other ways that you experimented with technology.
Yeah, I think sort of as a corollary of what you already said, because I definitely like using my iPad almost in every lesson these days for all the reasons you mentioned. But I think also another fun way of thinking is without actually having to use technology, is thinking in sort of like modern sort of 21st century sort of techie and social media ways. And what I mean by that, for example, is, going back to some other questions from earlier, like how do you get kids who are not on board on board? How do you create icebreakers or brainstorms that relate to their everyday lives? And, you know, something fun I've played around with is like on an identity theme tour, what if an activity or an icebreaker takes the form of like a quote-unquote Facebook post or Instagram post or Twitter post, even though they're not literally going to be doing that on their phone or their iPad with me in the gallery, they can write out what that Facebook post would be or what that Instagram pic would be of. So it's almost like taking these platforms that they're familiar with and making it into an art or writing activity, whether it's about you know, a spin on an identity. Like icebreaker could be like, if you were to Facebook post something about yourself every day, what about yourself would you be posting and why? What would that look like? So it's sort of a media technology-based thing without actually having to have that technology in the gallery or in the classroom. And even more specifically, with certain artists, like it's a very concrete example, but Ankuara is well represented in our collection, and he does very sort of interesting like precedents to sort of the world of social media, where he would send a telegram every day saying I'm still alive to his gallerist, or he would send a postcard every time he went on vacation saying I got up at blank 8:48 a.m. And how are these sort of artworks meaningful in terms of sharing with us about his identity? And you could turn that into an activity for kids. Like if you were to Instagram a picture of the same type of thing every day, what would you choose for that thing to be? Why? And what does that say about you? And I think these are nice sort of low-tech activities that relate to the high-tech world that can then be followed up. Like, why don't you go home and try that for a week and see how your friends respond to it? See how your acquaintances like comment on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I love that idea, Lisa, that you brought up of using the vernacular of technology without it having, you know, even if it's an analog or real, you know, real-time physical format. And that actually is very much what we're kind of thinking. I mentioned earlier about how right now we're play testing some new games, and these new games for families will likely take you know, the platform will likely be a mobile device, and we're definitely thinking, like Raquel mentioned, about some of the kind of, we want to capitalize on the behavior that we're already observing people are doing in the gallery. So, for example, you know, taking images with their smartphones as a way of memory making. That definitely is something that I think we'll be thinking a lot more about in the years moving forward. As you know, this generation is growing and they're total digital natives. We want to start, you know, changing the way that we teach them, so that it, you know, it's the methods that we use are not so removed from their daily lives. All right. Well, it is 7 o'clock right now, so we are actually out of time. Jessica, did you want to say any parting words?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many amazing questions that you guys have, and we really appreciate the really deep level of questions you've been asking and the deep level of conversation that you guys are all having with each other is the most enriching part of this course for us. So thank you for sharing some of that with us tonight. We're just sorry we couldn't get to all of them in an hour, but hopefully we've got all of our brains percolating a little bit, and thank you for spending this hour with us.
Yeah, and please keep the conversation going in the discussion forums. We've been really loving the kind of daily treat of logging on and seeing the lively sharing and posting happening. It's been really incredible. So, all right.
Thank you, Lisa.
guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Yeah,
Bye.
thank you especially to Lisa Libicki, our special guest.
Yeah,
Yay.
thank you, Lisa.
My
All
pleasure.
right. Good night, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.